Chinese President Xi Jinping is the leader everyone is vying to meet at this week's G20 summit in Bali, starting with meetings with the United States counterpart Joe Biden just yesterday. Mr. Xi has been in bilateral talks with world leaders on the sidelines of the gathering. President Xi met Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese earlier today, marking the first high-level meeting between the two countries since 2016. Now, the sit-down may mean a significant thawing of relations between China and Australia. Both sides have identified key issues to work on, expressing their commitment to continue maintaining their 50-year-strong bilateral ties.
过去几年呢，中澳关系遇到了一些困难，这个是我们不愿意看到。 因为中国和澳大利亚同为亚太地区的重要国家，我们呢应该改善、维护、发展好两个关系。
We have had our differences, and Australia won't resolve from our interests or our values, but our bilateral relationship is an important one. Both sides have worked to stabilise the relationship based upon mutual respect and mutual benefit.
Mr. Xi also met with leaders from countries like South Korea, France, Senegal, Argentina and Spain, each bringing with them their own agendas. Now, for more, CNA's Olivia Seong joins us live. She's in Bali. Olivia, President Xi has had a robust day, plenty of bilateral meetings for him. What do these meetings signal, though, for China?
Yes, Dawn, the G20 meeting may be the main event, but it's certainly the flurry of bilateral meetings that Mr. Xi is having that has caught the world's attention. But this clearly being a signal that Mr. Xi is returning to in-person diplomacy, which has been rare for him since the COVID-19 pandemic began about 3 years ago. Also significant given that this is Mr. Xi's first overseas trip he's making since securing a landmark third term at the helm following that key Communist Party Congress just last month. But what's also been interesting, look at who Mr. Xi and China has chosen to have FaceTime with in these first few meetings. Many of them actually key U.S. allies. We're talking about the likes of France, Australia, South Korea and the Netherlands. Perhaps symbolic then that Mr. Xi chose to kick off his bilateral meetings here in Bali yesterday with that 3-hour-long sit-down for the first time with his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden. But even though Mr. Xi in that meeting struck a conciliatory tone, saying that there was enough space in the world for China and the U.S. to exist, we know that China has come under pressure from the U.S. and is facing increasing scrutiny from the international community about its global ambitions. And so this time, we also see China trying to reach out to these key U.S. allies, also as it feels that America has been trying to shore up its alliances to counter China's rise. And even though these meetings that Mr. Xi has been having have been very short compared to yesterday's meeting, many of them lasting for under an hour, the message seems to be clear that China is offering somewhat of an olive branch, hoping to improve relations with many of these countries which it has faced tensions with in these last few years.
Olivia, tell us more about the closely watched China-Australia meeting that took place earlier.
That's right. This was perhaps the most highly anticipated meeting that Mr. Xi had today, given the deterioration of ties between the two countries in the last few years. This sit-down between Mr. Xi and the Australian leader marking a major shift and a thaw in very icy relations. As we've seen the two countries have issues, whether it's relating to China being angered with Australia's support for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 or over its restrictions placed on Chinese tech giant Huawei. But this time, Mr. Xi, calling for an improvement in China-Australia ties, adding that this used to be in the forefront of China's relations with developed countries for a long time and is, quote, worth cherishing. Although Mr. Xi did acknowledge the difficulties that China and Australia face, saying that this was something that both sides did not want to see. But a key area that Mr. Xi has focused on in his meeting with Australia was talking about the possibility of increased cooperation on the economic and trade front. As we know that Beijing has slapped those trade sanctions on many Australian goods as it has seen that deterioration of ties. But it looks like moving forward, China is looking to change that, also as it faces challenges at home with a slowdown in its economy as well. But what perhaps was not mentioned was how China addressed some of the thorny issues that were raised by Mr. Albanese, whether it's relating to China's human rights record or its relationship with Russia, given the invasion in Ukraine. This was not mentioned at all in China's foreign ministry readout. So it still remains to be seen, as key issues don't seem to be resolved moving forward. But clearly, the economic cooperation also being a key factor in other bilateral meetings that Mr. Xi had, including with South Korea as well.
All right, Olivia, thank you for that update. Olivia Song there speaking to us live from Bali. Roger Maynard reports from Sydney now with more on the Australian Prime Minister's meeting with the Chinese president.
The very fact that this meeting happened at all represents a significant political breakthrough. There were no preconditions for this meeting by either side. Before the talk started, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the Australia-China relationship was based on equality, mutual respect and a commitment to coexist peacefully. Although the meeting was held on the sidelines, it does suggest that the diplomatic standoff between China and Australia, which began in 2016, is beginning to thaw. And that could signal a partial return to a more productive relationship between Beijing and Canberra. Now, of course, it's early days. This afternoon's meeting represented baby steps in the gradual improvement in relations, and there's a lot at stake, notably the trade sanctions imposed by China, which is said to be costing Australia about $20 billion a year. It's been several years now since relations began to cool after the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull banned Huawei from Australia's 5G network. And things went further downhill when his successor, Scott Morrison, called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Even before today's meeting, Australian officials were not overly confident about a rapprochement with China in the near future. But at least both sides are speaking to each other, which is more than can be said for the past 2 to 3 years.
Also at the G20, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is accusing the West of politicizing the summit's joint declaration. He says his Western counterparts are pushing for a line to be included to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine on behalf of all participating countries. Well, CNA's Chatni Vadvani, she joins us live now from Bali with more. Chatni, can you just elaborate a little bit more on what Mr. Lavrov said about the West and also some of the other key takeaways from his news conference at the summit?
Well, based on comments or remarks rather made by Minister Lavrov, it is clear that Russia and the West could just be at odds for much longer. Now, according to Minister Lavrov, he says that his Western colleagues have tried to politicize the joint G20 declaration and condemn Russia. Now, Minister Lavrov also appears to be taking issue with certain parts of this potential joint G20 declaration. Now, I have had a look at the draft copy of this declaration. It is a draft copy. It has not been adopted yet. And in that copy, it says that leaders deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It says that most members strongly condemn war in Ukraine, stressing it is causing immense human suffering and exacerbating existing fragilities in the global economy. It also says that members are split on views surrounding sanctions and situations. And according to Minister Lavrov, he says that the West have added a phrase saying that many of the delegations have condemned Russia. And now he also says that while Russia did mention alternative viewpoints, he says that the West did not succeed in blaming Russia for failing to reach an agreement for the joint G20 declaration. Now, the West, he says, he says Russia also appearing to signal that it is willing to meet the world halfway regarding certain issues such as lifting barriers for energy markets, but it's also showing the world that it's not willing to compromise on certain issues, for example, Ukraine, where Minister Lavrov said that Ukraine is drawing out or rather prolonging a resolution to the conflict. And he did say also that Ukraine is refusing to talk to Moscow and putting forward unrealistic demands for peace.
Chetni Vadvani, live from Bali. Thank you.
Indonesian President Joko Widodo has called for unity at the opening of the G20 summit in Bali. He's urged fellow leaders not to allow the world to fall into another Cold War. Mr. Widodo says that the world is facing crisis after crisis and that international law is being tested. He says the G20 can continue to become a catalyst for inclusive economic recovery, so long as its members bridge its profound differences.
Mari kita perlihatkan kepada dunia bahwa kita dapat bersikap bijak, memikul tanggung jawab, dan menunjukkan jiwa kepemimpinan. Mari kita bekerja dan mari kita bekerja sama untuk dunia. Recover together, recover stronger.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky mirrors Mr. Widodo's urgency in his virtual address to the G20 summit in Bali. He stressed that it's time to end Russia's invasion of his country.
Ми не дамо Росії перечекати, наростити сили, а потім розпочати нову серію терору і глобальної дестабілізації. Впевнений, що саме зараз треба і можна зупинити руйнівну російську війну.
Mr. Zelensky mentioned key issues that plague not only Ukraine, but also the rest of the world. He calls for the expansion and indefinite extension of the grain deal brokered by the UN and Turkey, a deal that will expire on the 19th of November. Meantime, reports say a draft declaration by leaders of the G20 major economies show that most members strongly condemn war in Ukraine, stressing that it is making a fragile global economy even weaker. In the document, G20 leaders deplored in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But while there is condemnation, the draft acknowledges that there were other views.